This conference will now be recorded.
So this is where we are. We now have an understanding of what really a build pipelines are and etc. And we went ahead and we are trying to establish this model wherein you have multiple stages of deployment like development, testing, and production. Between each and every stage of deployment, meaning between development and testing, there is an approval. So someone has to come ahead and approve this out. And between testing and production, there is an approval. Someone has to come and approve all these things out and etc. Now, going further, what we did is that we went ahead and we started playing around with the JSON files. Like we said, we have an ARM template, and we take that particular ARM template and we said, okay, fine, we will create a build pipeline, which is nothing but it does a copy activity. And we included it or included that artifact in our main release pipeline. We went ahead and we said, okay, fine, let's include this artifact in our main release pipeline. And we created the infrastructure. And along with the infrastructure, we went ahead and we did a code deployment. This is where we stand today. And what I want to do today is that a couple of classes earlier, when we were doing Azure PaaS service, we did a demo on how a web app goes ahead and connects to, let's say, something like a SQL database. So we went ahead, we created a web app. So just to give you a recap of what we did back then, is that we went ahead, we created a web app, and we had a code, something like a SQL application. So if I open the code also, there was something called SQL app.sln file that basically that I had. So let me go ahead and open that out and keep it at a side. So we had a code. We deployed that code on top of the web app. So we had a code. We deployed that code particularly on top of the web app. And in order for the web application to communicate with this particular SQL server, we established something called as a connection string between the SQL server and the web app. So in the web app, we went ahead and we said we need a connection string, and the web application was able to communicate with SQL server using, let's say, this code that I have right now. So I have a code. So a couple of things out here is that I have a code. And before I go ahead proceed, guys, are you able to recollect this assignment that we did? Like, do you all remember what we did back then? A web app and a SQL server. Did you all practice that out? Yes, no, maybe.
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'll consider that then. Yes, yes, from everyone. So we had something like courses table, right? Wherein we basically went ahead and we added multiple courses into a SQL server. We said this course is like this rating and etc. And we projected it on the front end. Now I want to do this entire thing. I want to achieve this entire setup using Azure DevOps. Meaning I will now divide my assignments or I'll now divide my project into multiple things out here. And this is what I'm going to say is that there are a couple of key ingredients that I need to build this project. First thing, or the very first thing that I would say, is the infrastructure. Now, from an infrastructure perspective, I need a web app, plus I need a SQL server, an SQL server, plus I need a SQL database. And very importantly, I need the web app connecting to the SQL database using the connection strings. Connection strings out here. This is something that I need from an infrastructure perspective. From a code perspective, there are two things right now. One being the application, two being the data injection. Meaning this particular SQL server or this particular SQL database at the end of the day will hold some structured data. So we use some SQL queries in order to inject the data inside this, and we did it manually back then when we were dealing with the PaaS services. We tried to achieve this manually. In my case, now I'm using Azure DevOps for end-to-end operation. So for application building, I will use a CI pipeline, a continuous integration pipeline out here. And for code injection, I will use a .sql file. And where do I have everything? I have created a project, let's say, or I have, let's say, put everything into a public repository. So you can find everything out here. So I've given you everything that you need in this particular public repository called SQL local connection string. And this will have your ARM template, which we are going to look at in a minute. It will have the SQL application, the entire code. It will have the SQL commands, meaning all the commands that we have out here, like whatever that is required to go ahead and create the table. So I have a create table called course. Then I add something called insert statements and etc. So all these statements is something that I've placed here also in this particular repository also. So what I'll do is I'll firstly give the link to this repository and paste it out there in the chat so that you can share the same thing on the WhatsApp group. And this is required for this particular demo. Now, this is where I need to start right now. And to begin with, I will need a repository in Azure DevOps, right? So all this project, everything that I'm giving right now is in a public repository. Now the challenge is that I need to take everything from a public repository and get it into my private Azure repository because that's where my project is. In your case also the project might be in a private Azure repository. So I need to first create a repository. So these are the steps that we're going to follow right now. I need to first create a repo and take all this code, meaning all the folders, subfolders, and etc., infra, SQL, web app, everything, and let's say upload it into the repository, or let's say push it into the repository in a technical term. So what I'll do here is I'll open our project that we are working on, which is called 7am class project. So I'll go here and now I'll start creating a repository out here. So I'll say this is okay. Why am I having a build pipeline getting triggered? Just give me a second, guys. Let's see. Just give me one quick second. Just need to see this one. Okay, got it. Okay, that's fine. So coming down out here, I'll just go ahead and create a repository out here, and I'll say this is, let's say, web app SQL. I'll say demo. I'll say create this out. Now inside this repository, I need all this code. I need all these things, like all the folders. I need I need all of them to get reflected under this particular repository that we have created under our project. In your case also you have to do it because I all this code is there in a public repository. You cannot directly use it. So you have to take all this code and find out a way to get the code into your repository. Now I'm asking you all this. If I give you this link, ask you to get the code into your repository, what would be your approach? What would be your approach for the step number one? So I created a repository, and how would you push all this code into your repository right now? Anyone, any thoughts there?
Option called import.
Okay, import. Okay. Anyone think of anything else? Guys, did you all understand the question? Yes, no, maybe.
Yes, I think important.
Import only. So let's do that. So now clone to the local, yes, that's one of the option. That's right. So clone everything to your local machine, meaning go into this particular repository, go here and let's say go into the files and let's say clone everything into your local repository and then push it back into the private repository. This is something that you can do, or you can just copy this link. Okay, you can just copy this URL, go into your repository and say import a repository. This is the easiest way to do it. You can say import, paste the code here, meaning paste the link here that I just copied from the other repository and just click on import. This will take care of the cloning, this will take care of the pushing and etc. It will also basically bring all your branches, everything and all that stuff. So this is a straightforward methodology where you can go into the repository and directly pull all the code. So I did a clone of the repository from the public repository, which is my classes repo, to the private repository. So firstly, I cloned all my code. Now let's see what we have here. Now we sorry, we have an infrastructure file, which is nothing but a simple ARM template. So let's analyze this template and let's understand this. So I have this template on my local machine. So this template has some parameters called SQL server name, the DB name, meaning the name of the SQL server, the name of the database, app service plan name, the web app name. And when you create a SQL server, you also need to pass in the login ID and password. And very importantly, please observe this. The password is a type of a secure string. It's not just a string, it's a secure string out here. And when I sorry, when I look at the resources that are being created, I am now creating something called as a SQL server. And in the properties of this particular template, I'm passing in the administrator login and I'm saying, please go to the parameter section and get the SQL server or get the SQL username and go to the password section and get the SQL password. So I'm referring to these two parameters, which I haven't passed, which I haven't declared, which I don't want to expose in my template. I could have done something like default value and I could have passed it something like Microsoft -001. I could have done this. I don't want to do this. Reason being, I don't want to expose my password like this. So this is one of the main concerns that I do have. I also need to address the security of the entire architecture. So in the infra, I need to address the security. So that's the reason I am not passing in the default value out here and I'm just leaving it as a blank. And coming down, I have a SQL database that I'm creating, type called Microsoft.SQL and then database out here, wherein I am saying, okay, fine, this is the database. You can just directly use this the way it is. So you can just directly use the entire block of the code in your templates. And I'm saying this database depends upon the creation of the SQL server because you need a SQL server to have a database created. Then I'm saying I want an app service plan, just going ahead and creating an app service plan with F1 capacity. And I'm making sure that the app service plan creation is dependent upon the creation of the SQL server. So I'm first creating the SQL server, then creating the database, then creating the app service plan. And if I now scroll down, finally I have the web app. And inside this web app, I am using a property called site config, inside which I am passing a connection string so that the web application can get connected to the SQL server. And what am I doing here is that I use a function called concat and I'm building my entire connection string out here. And this is how I have passed the parameter SQL Server name here, and things like the DB name and the username and the administrator password. So I am building everything into this particular template. So this is now an end-to-end template. Once which is deployed, it will go ahead and lay down the entire infrastructure for me, which is like the web app, the SQL Server. It'll try to build everything out here. So it's going to try to build everything, and it's also going to make sure to have a connection between them using this property called a connection string out here. So this is what this template is trying to do, and I have this template inside my repository. So when I cloned it out, I have this template inside the repository. I have it all. I place it here. So this is what I do. I mean, this is what I have right now. This is for the infrastructure building, and this is the code that I have. It's a .NET Core application. So I have the code here. So these are the two things that I have right now. So what I'm going to do right now is I'll go to the pipeline and I'll say new pipeline, and let me call this as, or let me use something called as a classic editor. And in this new pipeline, I'm going to create this pipeline, and I'm going to point this pipeline to this particular project, to this particular repository, and to this particular branch of the repository, which is the main, because that is what holding all my code. So I'll come here and I'll say continue. I will say this is a .NET Core application. So I'll say this is .NET, and I'll just take the ASP.NET Core template. Say apply. Now this is the ASP.NET Core template. I'll just go ahead, select the Windows latest agent. Anything is good enough for this one. And I'll call this as SQL Web App Build. It's a build pipeline. So I'm just calling this as a build pipeline out here. And it's trying to do a SQL restore. I mean, it's trying to do a .NET restoration. And it's trying to look for a cs.project file. Sorry, a .cs project file. Instead of which I will give the path to the SLN file directly. So this is the path to the SLN file. Just take this and I'll say this is the path, and I'm giving the path directly to my code. I'm saying this is the path wherein you'll find the .sln file out here for the application. So you can use this out. Is something that I'm telling to my template. So I don't need this backslash also. You just leave it, and I'll say this is the path of the application. You can go ahead and take this out, and the restoration will restore or will try to restore the solution file. The build will try to build the solution file. I don't need a test case out here because I don't have test cases in this project. So I can remove this out, can remove this step, and the publish. I'll just uncheck this box so that I can publish the SLN file directly, and I'm publishing it into the build.artifact staging directory. So using these variables, whatever I did, whatever basically I went ahead and built a very simple project. I'm doing the same thing for this project also. Plus, I will also need my ARM templates right now. So I'll just say copy. So I'll just say add task, and I'm saying copy files. So this is the task that I'm adding, and I'm saying the source folder is the infrastructure, and I will say whatever file extension that you find with .json, please take this and send it to a folder called build.artifact staging directory. Artifact staging directory out here. So I'm placing this here, and I'll say save and queue. So code plus infra is what I'm getting here. Once I'm saving a save and run, This is now going to trigger the pipeline, and this pipeline is just going to do the same thing. It's going to build the .NET Core application for you. It's going to copy the infrastructure files, and it's going to publish it inside the artifacts, into the build.artifact staging directory, so that you can use it at a later point in time. This is what I'm doing at this point. So it's doing a restore, and this will take about a minute or so. And of course, I'm just giving you a very basic idea of the project. In your case, I want you all to get in something like branching policies, branching strategies, and also while you do the build pipeline, I also want the sonar to be included in this project. So I'm trying to do an end-to-end project, but in my case, since we have already covered those topics out, I'm not redoing it. But when you basically build this pipeline, please include the sonar validation, please include the sonar scanning and etc. And also make sure to put in the branch policies. These are the two things that I would request you all to do. And as and when the build pipeline is done, I have the artifact published. In this, I have two things. One being the SQL.zip, the other being the SQL app.json. These are the two things that I have right now. So what I'm going to do is following my procedure. So I have the infra, I have the code, I have the infra. I created a build pipeline which will produce, let's say, a .zip file and a .json file for the artifacts. Now this is what I need to do. I need to use my release pipeline. This is my release strategy. Firstly, create the infrastructure. So I'm creating the infrastructure using the .json file. And on top of the created infrastructure, I'm going ahead and releasing my code. So I'll use an Azure Web App Deploy in order to go ahead and release my code on the created infrastructure. Step 3, very important. I need to do a data injection because I haven't addressed the data at all. I need to do a data injection. So these are the 3 or 4 steps basically that I need in my pipeline. So with that, I'll go into the release definition and I will say create. I'll say a new release pipeline. And let me start with an empty job and let me just say that this is SQL Web App release. I have a build, I have a release, and I'll call my stage as development. In here, I'm adding the artifact from a build pipeline, which contains both my code and the infrastructure. So let's say this one is the build pipeline, which contains both the code and the infrastructure. And I'll say add. Now the first step is to create the infrastructure. So I will add a task here and I'll say it is ARM template deployment. I'll say add, and it's now asking me for a resource manager connection. I'll just go ahead and give this particular connection out here. That's the service connection that I do have right now. It's asking for the subscription. I'll just go ahead and give the subscription name. It's now asking me for a resource group name. I'll say it is $RG name. This is what I'm doing, and I'll make a note of all the variables that I'm declaring so that it will be easy for me at a later point in time to declare all these things out. So I have an RG name. This is the variable that I declared, and I'll just take it in East2S2. So I'm taking a location called East2S2 out here, and it's now asking for the template. I'll select the I'll select these three. I'll click on these three dots, go here into the drop, and I'll select a web app SQL.json. This is the JSON file that I'm looking at. And once inside this, I have a couple of parameters that I haven't declared at all. So there are a couple of parameters that I haven't declared at all. So let me go ahead and do the override parameter task. I'll say override template parameters. It has all these parameters that are yet to be declared. So I'll make a note of everything. So I'll say this is $SQL server name. So I am not I am not basically declaring it directly on the pipeline. I want to reuse it. So I am declaring parameters for everything. I'll say .SQL DB name. I'll say ASP name, which is for the plan. Web app name, which is for the name of the web app. The SQL username and the password. Again, I'll just make a note of all these things out. So it's a SQL Server name, etc. So that it will be helpful for me at a later point in time to build my code and etc. So I have a SQL DB name, just plan name, the web application name, SQL username, and the SQL password. So this is what I have right now. I'll declare this variables at a later point in time and I'll say OK. And I'll say this is infra creation, SQL plus web app. You can give any name to this task. And finally, I'll say add a task and I will say Azure App Service Deploy. And again, it's going to ask me for things like the service connection, taking the service connection out here, and it's asking for the app service name. It's coming from this variable called web app name. Just taking this name out here, and I'll say this is $web app name. This is what I'm doing. It's asking me for the package of the folder. I'll click on these three dots and I'll select the .zip file. So this is where I am creating the these two things out here. So release the code and create the infrastructure. I'll address the data injection in a second, but let me go ahead and declare all these variables right now. So I need my RG name again to be like dev RG for dev. I need the name of the SQL server to be something like dev SQL server 000, something like this, which is unique. Server, let's say healthcare. I'm putting just a unique name out here. USEs2. This is the name of the SQL server that I need. SQL DB will be test DB always, like whichever environment I'm deploying it, it will be test DB. App service plan name again is going to be dev plan 01 for dev and QA plan 01 for QA. Web app name is going to be something like dev web, I'll say SVRs, SERs, HT care, USEs2. So I'm just following the naming convention pattern for all of my services. And finally, I'll say the username of the SQL server should be something like test user. Password should be a secure value. I cannot expose my password as a plain text, but this should be or this can be the value of my password. If you look again, dev is common out here. So I'll add another variable out here called environment env. I'll say this is dev. So same thing what we did yesterday. I'm adding a common variable and from that common variable I am deriving all these things out. So I'll say variables. I'll say add a variable. I'll say env is my variable name environment. I'll say dev, which is scope to a stage called development. Then finally I'll add all these things out right now. I'll say our name will be $env rg. So because it is dev rg, it is development, it will become dev rg out here. Similar way, I'll just go ahead and declare the name of my SQL server. And I will say instead of dev out here, I will just change it to env, because I can reuse it for other environments as well. Env, and all these are scope to the release, meaning these are common variables out here. I'll say SQL DB name, give a common name here. This is test DB. For any environment, this is going to be test DB out here. I'll say ASP name. ASP name will be something like dev plan for a development environment. So it should be something like dollar open and close env plan 01. Web app name again is going to be same thing. It's going to take in the property called dev. So I'm adding this out and I'll just take this property. Just remove this and I'll say env environment, and SQL Server username will be test user, and SQL Server password should be a secret. This has to be a secret. So this is something that I need to take care of. So this is 001 and I will lock this. So this now is a password. So all these are the variables that I went ahead and declared out right now. And finally, one thing that I haven't done is that in the first step, I'm creating the infrastructure. In the second step, I'm deploying the code. So this is infra, this is code, but I also have certain SQL commands to run, right? I also have a couple of SQL commands to go ahead and create myself a table and inject some data into it. Now for that purpose, the last step that I'm going to execute is I'll just type in SQL, and there is something called as Azure SQL database deployment. I can take this out and add it. I'll say this is the last step. So I'm just changing the order, and inside this, I'll say data injection, which is going to be the final task of my pipeline, wherein I'm creating the infra, releasing the code, and then injecting the data out here. So now if I go into the task, it's going to ask me a couple of things like what is the name of the subscription. I'll say this is a service connection that you need, and it's telling me how should I authenticate your SQL server, like what do you want me to do. Do you want to give me a password, connection string, what it is? I will say I have the SQL Server ID and password. Firstly, it's asking me what is the Azure SQL Server, and if I click here, it's telling this is how you should pass. It should be Fabricam in the case in case if your database or if your server name is Fabricam, it's telling fabricam.database.windows.net 1433, which is the port of the SQL Server. I'm just copying this out for an example. Paste it here. So this is how you should pass. You should be passing. Fabricam is the name of the server, what Microsoft is giving as an example. .database.windows.net. This is going to be the fully qualified domain name, and 1433 out here. Now in my case, however, I have a name for the SQL server that I have, which is SQL server name. So I'll replace this Fabricam with the dollar SQL server name. So my database name is going to be whatever that you pass there, whatever the value that gets generated there, .database.windows.net, comma 1433, which is the port for the SQL server to operate on. It's now asking for the database. I also have a variable for the database, which is nothing but SQL DB name. So I'll go here and I'll say this is SQL database name. Finally, login and password. Even these are variables for me. So I'm reusing everything. So it is SQL username and SQL password. So I'm declaring this also as a variable. Make sure that there are no spaces anywhere. Otherwise, this task is going to fail. And this is the SQL admin password that I have. So every variable, I'm maintaining the state of every variable that I'm using. Same thing that I've used here, same thing that I used here, and same thing that I used here. And finally, it's asking me, how do you want to publish it? I will say it's a SQL inline script. It's an inline SQL script. I want to write a script here, and I have the commands here. So I need to do a couple of things. Firstly, to create a table, let me go back. I'll say create a table. And then after I create the table, I need to go ahead and inject the data. These are the 3 lines for injection of the data. These 3 lines going into my pipeline, paste it here. So 1 is the table creation. 2 is the data insertion into the creator table. These are the 2 things that I'm doing in the data injection. And before I do this, I need to give all these details on how I'm authenticating it and all that stuff. Any questions till here, guys? Anyone, anything till here? Any questions, guys? Anyone, anything, any questions till here? Are you all able to follow this? Anyone who's not able to follow? Guys, are you all following? Yes, no, maybe.
Yes,
Yes,
yes, Kiran.
Okay, so I'll just go ahead and save this out. And I'll say this is SQL release. And let's go ahead and create this release out. Let's see if we get any errors, and let's try to troubleshoot if we get any errors out here. I'll say create. And this should now start the code deployment. This should now start everything out here. So let's see this. Let's track this. Let's monitor this out. The very first task is going to be the infrastructure creation. It's going to take some time. Infrastructure usually takes like about 5 or 6 minutes out here. So uh, please ask any questions that you have. Please, ask any kind of a questions that you do have while this task is going on. So right now it's going ahead downloading all the artifact. And in the initialize job section, right? The first thing it's doing is that it's trying to go ahead and resolve all the variables out here. It's trying to get all the variable names. So if I, let's say, do a SQL server name, I got this as dev SQL server ht care uses2. And if I say ASP name, I have a dev plan 01. If I have a password, if I look for a password, I'm not getting the password at all. SQL admin or SQL username. I'm getting a SQL username, but SQL admin password, I will not get this. Reason being, this is now passed as a secret. So Azure DevOps will not expose this at all. So this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make sure that these passwords are protected. These sensitive information is actually protected without losing the state of my pipeline. And right now it's telling, okay, fine, dev.rg, you wanted me to create dev.rg. So let me go here. It would have created a dev.rg out here. And if I look at the deployments, it's now deploying this out. And it is now going ahead and creating all the resources that I wanted it to. So it created a SQL server, created a web app, or it will finally create a web app rather. It's creating, let's say, all the infrastructure that is required in the same way that you asked for it. So it's creating a database, it's creating a plan, it's creating a web app, it's doing all these things out here. and everything is achieved from the pipeline only. I am not touching my portal, I am not touching anything out. There is one pipeline that will manage all these things out, and this will create my infrastructure, this will inject the data, it will all do everything. I can just leave this pipeline, I can take a break and also come back. So it's that easier, it's that automated right now. So the goal here is to make sure we automate as much as possible. So make sure that we automate as much as possible with minimal errors. So this is done. It went ahead, created everything that I needed, and this will now say, okay, fine, I'm done. And second or the third task here is to go ahead and let's say it will deploy the code onto the Azure web app that is created earlier. So I am maintaining the state of my variables and I'm telling that, you know what, all my variables should stay the way they are. And now it's going ahead and doing, let's say, this particular injection, and it will now try to go ahead and deploy the code into my web application. So this is what it's going to do, and let's see how it does, and let's see what is the logic behind it and etc. Once the code deployment is done, it will finally inject the data into it. Now the data injection can come first, code deployment can come next, it's fine. But the first task should always be your infrastructure creation, because you don't have an infrastructure. And let's see this, and this is what they're going to ask, guys. Like, they're going to ask what is the project that you worked on and etc. This can be one of the examples that you can quote, that this is the project, this is how we made sure to create the pipelines, this was the template and etc. So this can be one of the end-to-end projects that you can say in your interviews whenever they ask that, what did you work on and etc. What did you really, or what are the real-time challenges that you faced and so on and so forth. Now my pipeline is done. It took me around 4 minutes to do this. And if I did it manually, it would have taken me a lot of time more than this one out. So it took me 4 minutes to do this, and it went ahead, created the infrastructure firstly, created the Azure Web App, injected the data. It managed everything for me. So let me go ahead and check a couple of things right now. So I'll go into the dev.rg. I have all the infrastructure that I need, which is the plan, which is the SQL server, which is the database, and then I also have the app service out here. Now, if I go into the database, which is testdb, let me log into this database using the query editor, and let me see, or let me say Microsoft-001, and let me log into this. Now, let's do that, and let's wait for a minute to go ahead and log in. It will take usually a minute or two to go ahead and log in. It says, okay, fine, cannot open the connection and all, because my IP is not whitelisted. So I'll just click on this link telling it allow my IP so that I can go ahead and log into the server. It'll take a minute and I'll say okay. And it's now letting me into the database. And if I go into the tables, I should be able to see one table called course, which has multiple, let's say, views and all that stuff, meaning which has all the data. So if I say select star from dbo.course, meaning I'm doing a select statement onto that particular table. And if I run this query out, I should be able to get some kind of a result out here. This is what I'm trying to do. So this is taking some time in order to get the result. And here we are able to see that these results are up, or these are like, kind of coming in. This is something that I wanted to verify. Second thing is that if I go into the dev.rg, if I go into the web app, if I go into, let's say, configuration, let me see if the connection string is also present, because for my web app to work fine, or for my web app to work successfully, I need a connection string which is pointing to the SQL server with the right ID and the password. So it has the ID. So it's saying the user ID is test user and the password is something like Microsoft hyphen 001. So it has this ID, it has all these things out. So let me now try to browse the application. Let me see if I get any errors, or let me see how the application actually responds. And let me check this out. And now it's working fine. It's giving me a call, it's going ahead and it's able to get the list of services and all that stuff. So this is the end-to-end process that I wanted to do using my using the knowledge that I have on Azure DevOps and using a bit of infrastructure knowledge that I do have. So I basically have a bit of infrastructure knowledge. I have a bit of Azure DevOps knowledge and etc. So I combine both of these things and I'm trying to create something out of it. Now, one thing is this, guys, is that if I redeploy this pipeline, meaning this is not just a one-time use, right? Every time the developer pushes a new code, it has to go ahead and let's say trigger this pipeline out and it has to update the code there, right? So if I re-trigger this pipeline, do you all think I should have any issues? Do you all think I should have any failures, or are we good with this? Yes, no, maybe. Do you all think I should
I
have any
think
failures, any sort? Mhm.
SQL
I think we
database.
have a SQL database here.
Okay, so what about SQL database?
Like if they are trying to insert one new record, we need
Hmm.
to add in the new record in the query editor. Like we have uh, added in the
Hmm.
like some console, right? So there we need
Correct.
to add one more record, like insert record
One more record. Okay. Okay. Insert record. Okay. But my insert is again coming from this particular SQL command. Like, it's coming from this particular step, which is going ahead and
data
basically going
injection.
ahead and adding all these things. Yes. So it's doing a data injection. So if you need to add any step or if you need to add any data, I can add it directly out here. Like I can say insert into, let's say, course, and I can basically add a new record out here, which I could have done. So let me do that again. But let's see what it's doing right now. Right now, it's just checking if the infrastructure is there. It'll see the infrastructure is there. It'll go ahead. It'll deploy the code again, meaning if there is a new code, it'll go ahead and deploy. And if I added something, meaning in the data injection, if I went ahead and added something out here, then even that particular row or even that particular set of data should be injected into my SQL, meaning I don't want to manually go ahead and inject something. I don't want to manually go ahead and update it on the backend. Now everything here is my backend. Everything that is there on the Azure portal is the backend. And now my policy is that I don't want anyone to go ahead and update the backend directly. I don't want anyone to go ahead and do a query editor and run, let's say, tasks manually. The reason being, all this is, let's say, tested at a very high level and we don't need backend changes. That's the reason we automated everything and the task failed. Now let's see the logs. Now your infrastructure ran well. This is good. Your code deployment ran well, even this is good. But this failed. It now says data injection is something that got failed. And if I now go ahead and click this out, it's giving me an error that there is already an object with the name course in the database. What do you all understand by this, guys?
Like table codes is already existed, so
Table courses already exist. Exactly.
we
Table
are
course
trying to
is already
reinsert
there.
the same table.
Yeah. Not trying to reinsert it. If you look at the script, we are trying to recreate it. The first thing that the script is actually doing is that the script is trying to recreate the table called course. And after it's trying to recreate the table, then it's going ahead and saying, okay, fine, I'll insert all these things out here. This is an issue. Meaning if I even hit it from the backend, I'll still get the same issue. Meaning if I go ahead, take the same SQL script. So this is the SQL script that I have. Let me say edit release. This is the SQL script that I have, which is doing one thing. Just trying to create a table firstly, and then it's trying to insert the records. But this table already exists. It already does exist. So that's the reason now my script is failing. So what I'll do in order to overcome this issue, I'll just write one small statement out here. I'll say drop table if exists. I'll say the name of the table is course. I'll give a statement called go. Meaning, what am I trying to do is that I am trying to drop the table firstly called course, and then I'm trying to recreate it. This is typically how databases get updated. We delete the existing table, then we try to recreate it out. You can come through a SQL script. You can come through something called as a database deployment. Everything will try to achieve the same process out here, which is going ahead, which is just going ahead and dropping the existing table. So that's the reason I'm saying if the table exists, please go ahead and drop it. For the first time, the statement will not even, or the statement will execute, but it will basically tell that the table doesn't exist. So I'm not dropping it. So I'm putting an if condition out here. I'm copying this entire thing, pasting it here in my release. In order to test it out, I know my infrastructure is already there. I know my code is already there. I'll just disable these two tasks and I'll just run this particular data injection set. I just want to make sure that this works. So I just put in a very simple statement out here called drop table if exists. And I want to see whether that works or whether that also throws an error and etc. So in order to make sure that the pipeline is reusable, you need to slightly improve the logic. You need to understand where your pipeline is failing. In my case, the pipeline was failing at, let's say, this particular drop statement, wherein it was telling that, you know what, the table already exists, so I cannot just go ahead and create it again. So you need to be a bit more, let's say, your script needs to do something more. It's something is the error what I was getting there. So that's the reason I'm going ahead and putting in one more statement out here. And let's see if it gives an error, or yes, it did give an error. Let's see what the error right now is. So yes, there is an incorrect syntax at go. So there is some syntax issue out here. Let's see what did I do in my earlier project. Let me do one quick thing. Now I am not a database administrator again, so my SQL statements are not that great. Oh, let me see. What did I do earlier? So I'll just correct my syntax there. Okay, so the comma should have been there and the syntax should have been slightly more corrected. So let's do one thing. I'll just copy this out and let me paste it here. Instead of products, I'll just take the name of the table called course. So slight correction out here. And what I'll also do is take the entire thing what I'm doing out here and I'll update in our project also, so that whenever you are creating this out, so whenever you are going ahead and creating it out, you take the latest code and you should be good. Like I'll update it in our public repository also. So let me go here and let me put the statement here in the public repository. I'll put it in the last so that you can rearrange it the way you want it. Say drop statement. And finally, time to correct our pipeline. I'll just go here and I'll say this is the release. I'll just say edit this release, go into the task, I'll replace this task with the right syntax. So this is the syntax issue that I got. If I now save this out and now give a redeploy, this should work. So depending upon what your error is, so this is the fourth time or this is the third time what I got my error. In the second time, it's telling that the course was already existing. In the third time, it was telling that, okay, fine, there is an incorrect syntax out here. So that's something that you need to correct. In the fourth time, I'm just correcting the syntax. Now, usually this SQL statements, right? You don't have to worry about this. This is something that the database administrators or the developers are going to give you. It is their duty. It is their, let's say, responsibility to go ahead and to give those statements to you all. But it depends on how you use these statements out here in your pipelines and how do you troubleshoot it when an error comes into picture. So this is what I was trying to project. Errors is something that you'll get for sure, like in any pipeline that you can kind of work with. Errors are you are going to get the errors. So it's very important to understand how to troubleshoot the error. It's very important to understand firstly what the error is telling and then to troubleshoot it accordingly. Okay, so any questions still here, guys? Anyone, any questions still here? So can you all try this out in your own projects? Can you all do this before you come to tomorrow's class to go ahead and create the same thing what we did today? Yes, no, maybe, guys.
Yeah, we will try.
Yes, sir.
So please try to do the same thing. Please clone the repository. And my request is try it on your own and then follow the video. Because if you look at the video, pause it, and then try it, right? Then it's not going to really help you a lot because you have the video to kind of go ahead and refer back to. So please look at the video first, then try it on your own. If you're getting stuck somewhere, only then look at the video out. Okay, guys, so that's it from mine today. Then we'll meet tomorrow and we'll discuss more on how to improve our security in the pipelines and etc. Thank you, guys, and have a great day ahead.